Okay, hello everybody, good evening, and welcome to this Scotland Salon event. Mo did a little bit of outlining there, but the Scotland Salon is part of the Academy of Ideas network of salons, and it's really an attempt to create spaces where people can come together, discuss ideas, tolerate other ideas, but robustly challenge as well. And I'm very keen, again, as Mo indicated, for the audience to participate. So we've got an esteemed expert panel of speakers to do some short provocations, but after that, it's really over to the audience to ask questions, yes, to listen, yes, but also very keenly to get people to share their experiences and their perspectives and their thoughts. The Academy has a small staff team, and they're providing technology and technological and publicity support for us. They need some money, basically. So in the way that we would do this, if we were in a pub or in a hall, in the back room of a pub or in a hall, we would probably take a whip round to cover the cost of the room. If people feel they would like to, there's probably a screen coming up where you can make donations. There's a link coming up where you can make donations to the Academy now. So to business, the unintended consequences of lockdown. Lockdown is a strange term that we've become very used to over the last period. And anything on such a grand scale, in my opinion, will inevitably result in some unplanned consequences. It's a huge undertaking that the government has done. And with any society-wide action, there will be society-wide consequences and impacts. And therefore, there are, I suppose, any number of specialists we could have had along tonight. People from the arts, people from sport, educationalists, elderly care, special needs young people care, young offenders institutions I was reading about recently as well. Outdoor education, my particular specialism has been hit hard. Retailers we've been reading about this week as well, framing everything within the wider society. So we could have had any number of specialists, and hopefully the audience will be the specialists from all the different areas. But tonight we have an esteemed panel, and we're privileged to have such. So in the order that they'll speak, firstly we have Ewan Gurr, who's a journalist, anti-poverty campaigner, and food bank pioneer. There are much longer biographies that will appear on the screen. I'm going to go through people's pretty quickly, because we'd be here all night listening to me talking about them. Secondly, Professor Carol Sikora, who's the Chief Medical Officer at Rutherford Health. He's a former director of the World Health Organization's cancer program, and also he was the professor and chairman of the Department of Cancer Medicine at Imperial College School of Medicine. Imperial College, who we've been hearing a lot from over the last 9 months. Then we have Dr. Stuart WAITON, who's a senior lecturer in sociology and criminology at Abertay University. Stuart also writes for a number of newspapers and is regularly asked to give comment in the news and various other media about the criminalisation and over-regulation of everyday life. Then we have Annemarie Ward, who's the Chief Executive Officer of Faces and Voices of Recovery UK. And Annemarie has been involved in addictions and health drug partnerships for a long time, and has carried out research in the sector and continues to carry out small research projects. Again, there's more on Annemarie that will be coming up, as well as a Facebook connection, I'm sure. And then lastly, we have Rob Lyons, who's the Science and Technology Director at the Academy of Ideas. And Rob too is also invited frequently to commentate on current affairs, radio, television. He's been on Newsnight, Channel 4 News, BBC Breakfast, and other programs. So without further ado, we'll just press on, and we'll have each speaker doing between 5 and 6 minutes on their particular area, and then we're going to come out to you. So listen, actively listen, be prepared to ask questions, yes, but be prepared to share your thoughts. We're really interested, and the audience will be really interested in your particular perspectives on this. So, Ewan, first of all, please.
Good evening. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Excellent. First of all, I just want to express my gratitude to Simon, to Mo, and to Sarah for the invitation to contribute tonight. I attended my first Academy of Ideas event in Stockport earlier this year, pre-lockdown, and it was great to be situated among so many like minds. Second of all, yeah, my name is Ewan Gurr. I was described in the blurb as a journalist and a campaigner. I'm actually neither of those things. I am a strategic advisor on social security to the Scottish Government, but I have worked for 15 years in the voluntary sector alongside people experiencing poverty. In terms of the subject tonight, I want to start back in March. I was in Uganda at the time when lockdown measures were imposed in Scotland and obviously the wider United Kingdom. And overnight I went from a family-oriented, community-based, close-knit, hand-holding culture where everyone exists in close proximity to one another, to coming home. And in short, I went from liberty to lockdown. And I've been asked this evening to address the social effects as a constituent part of the wider conversation on unintended consequences of lockdown. So first of all, I'd like to just give you some figures. We have 27 million people who have failed to get a GP appointment. We have 6 million people who have had a cancer screening delayed. We have 1.2 million food parcels that have been provided between April and September this year. We have 1 in 10 people who are currently experiencing suicidal thoughts. We have an estimated 200,000 deaths that will be linked to the impact of lockdown. And we have a 22% drop in GDP that is going to lead to the longest recession in my lifetime and probably also yours. And I want to share a wee story of my 80-year-old friend, Rab, who I spoke to yesterday on the phone. Rab found a lump that he is concerned at the moment is cancerous. He was told that he would hear from his local hospital within 10 working days, and he's now been waiting for over 2 months. Now, this is a hospital where friends of his work and who are complaining that they're sitting doing nothing because they're hamstrung by the overcompensation and underutilization of COVID provision in that particular hospital. The first thing I would say in relation to unintended consequences is I'm not entirely sure at the moment how unintended they are. And by that, I don't mean that the Scottish Government is intending to do harm to people. But at First Minister's questions last week, Nicola Sturgeon said that my priority is to save lives and to protect health. Now, I was on the phone with the Scottish Government Health Secretary last week, who rejected the implication that the Scottish Government is not acting in the best interests of the public. And to an extent, I agree with her. But when you have an estimated 200,000 deaths that will be linked to the effect of lockdown, you have to question whether that really is the priority. I think the greatest casualty of lockdown has been individual liberty. Having worked in the field of having worked in the voluntary sector with people experiencing poverty, I've learned one thing, that you cannot put a price on liberty and you trade it at your peril. People experiencing poverty have their freedom, their liberty, their personal agency, their access to choice stripped away consistently. And most of the analysis at the top tiers of government purports a different narrative, which is that a lack of money is at the heart of poverty. But poverty is much more multifaceted than that. You can throw as much money as you want towards a problem, but unless you can trust the agency of the individual to whom you have dispensed that resource, you cannot fully address the problem. An interesting quote that I've heard a couple of times is Benjamin Franklin's, which is those who would give up essential liberty to purchase a little temporary safety deserve neither liberty nor safety. So I'm just going to close with this. I don't want to take too much time. I've got more thoughts, but I just want to close on this thought. I think the major question that we face as we emerge out of this crisis is this: how do both the UK and the Scottish governments establish the balance between using the levers they have to deploy resources to ensure they provide a supportive cushion to temporarily insulate the men, women and children for whom the coming year is going to be incredibly financially fraught, without becoming over paternalistic in the use of legislation that restricts the freedom and the liberty that is a contingent part of what makes us human? Over to you, Simon.
Thanks, Ewan. very short and succinct. Good. Okay, Professor Carroll. Is that how I call you, or just Carol?
Carol,
Carol,
a really great pleasure to be here. And that was very moving, Ewan. I really liked the concept. Liberty is very important. So I'm a cancer specialist. So let me just fill in a bit more from your case history of your friend with the lump and not getting treatment. So what happened in April was suddenly all hospital services, other than those dealing with COVID, stopped. And that was probably correct. There was no way of predicting how bad things were going to get. On April the 8th, they looked as though they were beginning to stop in terms of number of admissions, and then they went down. And it actually wasn't too bad. And by the summer, it was picking up again. Everything was getting back to work. The NHS was getting back to work. Again, what happened in October was, again, the NHS in various places, it was much more regionalized this second time round, started to concentrate on COVID and forget other things. And so there are probably something like 6 million people waiting for something in the NHS now that weren't waiting for anything in the past. The normal waiting list for procedures is about 1.5 million people. And that's a feature of the NHS. It's a ration system compared to some of the European systems where everything's done next week. But that's a long-term problem. But the short-term problem is we now have a lot of people waiting, and some of those people are bound to have cancer. And we know that because unlike COVID, where every day you see the figures of admissions, of deaths, of people on ventilators going up and down, you can see it. Today, it's great. I mean, the number of admissions are right down, less than 1,200 admissions across the UK. There are something like 150 acute hospitals, so you can work out it's not that many. The system is not flooded at the moment. So there's no reason that cancer patients, cancer screening, cancer investigations shouldn't go ahead as normal. So what we've seen at the beginning, cancer doesn't go up and down, as I said. The figures are very simple for the back of the envelope. You don't need to be brain of Britain to calculate this. There are 360,000 people a year that get cancer. That's 1,000 new patients a day get cancer. And of that, and that's constant throughout the winter and the summer. And the diagnosis of cancer is taken care of by a biopsy, a sample of tissues removed, a variety of techniques, from needles, from endoscopy, where a tube's put up the bottom or the top of the intestine. And basically we get a sample and that categorizes someone as having cancer. And then we do all sorts of tests to work out what's going on. So all one needed to look at is how we're doing with cancer, how many patients a day from March 23rd, the beginning of lockdown, presented with cancer. There should be 1,000 a day, that's 30,000 a month. In the months of April, May, and June, there were less than 5,000 across the UK. So a precipitous fall. Now, the problem with delay in cancer is that it allows cancer to spread. Cancer arises in an organ. The common four tumors are lung, breast, colon, and prostate, and then it starts spreading. And when it spreads, it gets more difficult to treat, and the outcomes are poorer for a variety of reasons. And we know that. And it's really quite precipitous, the fall in outcomes. So you take breast cancer, a woman with an early breast cancer has a 95% chance of being cured. Fantastic. It totally changed since I became a consultant 40 years ago. This is just fantastic. But if you wait till the disease has spread beyond the immediate lymph nodes in the armpit, and it's spread maybe to the chest nodes or deep to the abdominal nodes, the prognosis falls to a cure rate of less than 25%. So you go from 95% to 25% within a few months. And obviously, some patients have rapidly growing cancers, others less rapidly growing cancers. So there's no doubt that cancer figures for 2020 are going to be dreadful. And part of it is the NHS switching completely to COVID, but also protect the NHS, stay home, keep safe, and all these messages, protect the NHS. A lot of people with cancer symptoms didn't do anything about it. They wanted to protect the NHS. It doesn't need protection, it's there for you. And that was the message that was missed. And of course, the psychops team at number 10 Downing Street kept pushing that message, and they're pushing it again now in the second lockdown that's just been released today. And there's no doubt that we've got to change that approach. The unintended consequences of lockdown for cancer are going to be a disaster. We've just done an analysis looking at the number of life years lost, because that's a totally different way. It's not the number, it takes age into consideration. Even though I'm very old, as you can see, I'm quite ageist about it. And if you look at life years lost from COVID, because people that die with COVID, sadly, tend to be, well, the average age is 83.4 months. So they're actually quite late in life. They haven't got that much longer to go. With cancer, they have a lot longer to go. So the life years lost from a cancer patient not getting adequate treatment is much greater than from a COVID patient. It's difficult to make these balances, and we can't do it in real medicine, but there's no doubt there are problems. So it's not just cancer, of course. It's things like heart attacks, down by 45% in the summer. Crazy. And that's, how would you imagine someone not going to hospital? They were too scared to call an ambulance. They just sat there with chest pain and waited for it to go away. Some are lucky they survived, but the problem will be they'll get heart failure in the next few years because the muscle of the heart has been irrevocably damaged. And then stroke, the same problem. And then, of course, there's the other illnesses that have been part of the unintended consequences, the illnesses we forget about, mental health, deafness in children, the sorts of things that you wouldn't imagine have any priority, and they don't have priority in the NHS. Every time there's a round of cuts, what about counselling for children with sexual disorders? Very difficult to do, unpopular, and not a great vote winner. So it's just taken off the list. And all these unintended consequences piled up because of COVID. Now, if you look at the media, it's pretty frightening. There's clearly psychological operations going on even as we speak. The vaccine is the holy grail. We all have to admit that it's going to be wonderful. It's a pity it's not the Oxford vaccine that's going to be dished out next week. It's the American vaccine.
Can I give you about a minute, Carol?
Thank you. And so it's clear that as we move forward, we have to think about unintended consequences. Tonight, when we're finished, I can go to the pub and get a drink down here. But, you know, down in Slough, which is 5 minutes from where I live by car, you can't get a drink because it's in tier 3. And there's all sorts of inconsistencies. So we've got to get out of this, and we've got to look at both healthcare and social care and see how we can do things better with or without the vaccine. It's pretty important we clear everything up. Thanks very much, Simon.
Brilliant. Okay, thanks very much. So next we're going to just move on to Stuart Waiton, who I've given a brief to a slightly awkward job tonight because I've asked him to try and pull some kind of sociological glue to try and pull these different strands together. So we'll see if he's successful or not.
Thanks, Simon. So rather than the science, I thought, why not have some social science in trying to understand what's going on? So a lot of this relates to trends that predate COVID, but some of them then interconnect with it. And I'm just going to give some kind of bullet points, 6 or 7 bullet points that I think are worth considering. So first of all, is there a tendency in society today to over-exaggerate problems? I would argue that there is, and there is something that has been called the precautionary principle to life, which appears to have developed over the last 20 years or so. And this is a principle grounded in a world where being safe, safer, and safest has developed into a form of moral goodness. Secondly, within this general safety culture, has health become a political football? I think it has. I think from smoking to drinking to what we eat, our mental well-being, even our healthy relationships, health has become an expanding category and one that governments feel is an area of life, perhaps more than any other, that they must get involved in. So does this turn health into something different, into another moral category, perhaps? Third point or question in part is who rules today? Social science is often interested in who rules. Is it the old conservative business class, or do the collective working class rule? Answer, I'd suggest, is none of the above. The labour movement has had very little influence on political life, again, for over a generation, except this time round, I suppose the unions have been of some use more than anything to the lockdown promoters, because the only thing they seem to be able to promote is more safety. More interestingly, in a world where, especially in sociology, everyone tells us we live in a neoliberal world, what I've thought was quite fascinating is the business class appear to have no voice, or very little voice, when it comes to pressurizing or promoting business ahead of other concerns, which leads us to this discussion about the new elites, of which there is a lot of discussion about the new elites at the minute. Have the experts taken over the asylum? I think they have, to a certain extent. Is this a problem? I think it does become a problem, because it becomes a one-sided type of society with very distant professional elite sections of society coming to dominate. I think we've seen something called science become politicized to a certain extent and become what some people call the science, which has the danger of squeezing out wider scientific discussion. I also think there's a danger within this framework of this narrow expert knowledge squeezing out society to a certain extent, wider political, economic and social discussions, and even health discussions, as Carol has pointed out there. Have we seen a balance in the media? I think I would say fairly clearly this has not been the case. Even newspapers like the Daily Mail, who do have dissenting voices at times, the articles, the way they write their articles is they use the word soar. I don't know with my accent if you can actually hear it, but soaring, the numbers soar, right? So it's like two more deaths soared, right? And they keep, it's obviously an editorial policy to use this word soar. And that's before you look at many of the other aspects of the media, whether it's STV News finding children to say, yes, how much they love wearing masks in school, for example, or where the news seemed determined to find every young person possible in the world who died of COVID to try and convince us that this was a disease that can kill everybody, if you can remember those days. And I say this as a joke, but I'm not joking that if I was going to give an award for investigative journalism in terms of someone who has asked more critical questions than anybody else, bizarrely, I would give it to Philip Schofield, which is extraordinary. I know, and I'm not joking, even though it's a joke, because he has been more critical on morning television than I've seen just about anybody. Is there a tendency or a general tendency to limit our freedom? I would say there is at the minute amongst a political class who see their job as educating us and making us aware. I think they've grown accustomed to using certain sections of society to use experts to solve problems on our behalf and to manage our behavior, to try and nudge us to live and behave in a correct way, rather than engage with us as intelligent, free-thinking adults. So to finish, does this mean that all the government's responses to the virus are out of kilter and flawed? Not necessarily, and I'm actually interested in this discussion to see what people think about it, because obviously this is a genuine problem. However, I do think there has been a lack of balance in weighing up the dangers. I also think there has been a disappointing disconnect between government science and alternative perspectives, which I would have loved weekly, at least open discussions between scientists of different perspectives, rather than having this one-dimensional approach, as it appears to me to a certain extent. And to finish, I think this is partly the reason this has happened, is partly because the governments of the UK, and particularly the Scottish government in particular, distrust the public, and rather than seeing us all as a source or an army of assistance and knowledge and support in a time of crisis, see us as a problem or a risk to be managed.
Thank you. Very succinct, bang on time. Over to Annemarie.
Thank you very much, everybody, and thank you to the panel and everyone involved for giving me the opportunity to speak to you tonight, primarily about my field, which is addiction and mental health. I hope you can understand my accent as well. It's quite thick Glaswegian. I'll do my best to speak slowly. Those of us supporting people who need help with their drug and alcohol use knew that we were already in severe crisis going into this pandemic. Pre-COVID-19, it might surprise you to know that we already had the highest levels of drug-related deaths on record in the world here in Scotland, and that funding levels had fell off a cliff during the last 10 years. It may also surprise you to know that people across large areas of the country, both in Scotland and the rest of the UK, have no access to rehab or inpatient detox provision, and there's a growing dearth of specialist services for young people, women, rough sleepers, or for families of people who are affected by addiction. In Scotland, we've seen a massive politicisation of new interventions, in particular drug consumption rooms, which I'll come back to, and increasing numbers of people paying for healthcare themselves that should be provided by the NHS. So the fact that the pandemic has worsened this crisis is no surprise. What is surprising, though, is our silence as a field. Mental health and addiction charities are completely hamstrung by their impossible contractual obligations, continually being asked to do more for less. And if they protest even slightly, they run the risk of losing their contracts altogether. So it's left to small advocacy organisations like mine, Faces and Voices of Recovery, to speak out. In September, the Royal College of Psychiatrists, drawing on Public Health England figures, reported that 8.4 million people's drinking was higher risk. This was up almost double from 4.8 million in February. Alcoholics Anonymous say that in the 6 months of the pandemic, the first 6 months, it dealt with 53,000 inquiries compared with only 19,000 for the year before. Data from the National Drug Treatment Monitoring System in England shows a 20% increase in adults seeking help for addiction services, and inquiries to the Priory were up 26%. We don't have the same counting systems in place in Scotland, so it's impossible to tell what's happening here, which is highly convenient politically. The Centre for Mental Health has predicted that up to 10 million people, almost a fifth of the population, will need mental health support as a direct consequence of COVID, and 1.5 million of them are children. COVID has accelerated addiction that might have otherwise crept up on people over time. Social isolation, loss of control over the situation we find ourselves in, working from home, not connecting with support networks or structures, all of these issues have been triggered, and have triggered spikes in suicide, self-harm, alcoholism and domestic abuse. All of these in the affected population who were considered well at the beginning of lockdown. The response from politicians on the addiction and mental health tsunami is just to play the blame shifting game. Not only does it lack responsibility and accountability, it's actually really sick and morally repugnant behaviour to observe. We have, as an organisation and individuals in recovery, asked politicians to stop playing political football with what is unequivocally a cross-party issue. Our requests for compassion and common sense have not just been ignored, but more worryingly, stonewalled. In Scotland, we witness this ongoing game with the drug consumption room debate. It's a straw man fallacy that absolves the current administration of accountability and muddies the water within the public consciousness. It's really simple. In Scotland, we have the same laws as the rest of the UK, yet we have 3 times the amount of deaths. So it's not a lack of drug consumption rooms that's killing people, it's poverty and a combination of the halving of the funding since 2010 and really bad practice, particularly in Scotland. Allow me to tell you about the microcosm that is Glasgow. In Glasgow, we see that addiction treatment is funded to the tune of £47 million per year, but only £500,000 of that is spent on helping people get into rehab, get off drugs, get well and rebuild their lives. For the 22,500 problem drug users in Greater Glasgow and Clyde area, there are only 13 rehab beds. Is it any wonder we are dying in greater numbers than anywhere else in the world? Evidence-based rehab has not been a priority despite a record level of fatalities. We welcome and advocate for drug consumption rooms to be opened in Glasgow to help stop this catastrophic amount of deaths, but in Glasgow the projected cost to run a drug consumption room is £2.4 million annually. We spend £3.4 million on clean needles. That's almost 10 times the amount we spend on helping people get off drugs being used to help people use drugs safely. We don't believe that this is an either or situation. Instead, we are asking for a redressing of balance in what we invest in and have a belief in the power of people's ability to recover if given the right support and therapeutic interventions. We would like to have seen Scotland's Drug Death Task Force call to Scottish ministers to urgently set out further investment in measures in publicly funded rehab programmes, as well as wraparound support for housing and other support services. These vital life-saving interventions would undoubtedly turn the tide. Until we start to help people get out of addiction and into recovery, we will continue to see this epidemic rise. Without long-term sustained and adequate investment in actual treatment and not just in substitution therapies, we won't deliver the impact needed to save lives. This crisis needs a new coordinated approach and new investment. Above all, we need accountability. Politicians and industry experts keep talking and keep having meetings. They keep creating reports, they keep setting up more and more never-ending subgroups, and as a result of this, we keep dying. The deaths of our family and friends were avoidable, and they are avoidable. Public agencies have become unaccountable empires outside of democracy. Commercial lobbyists seem to decide the government's agenda and conduct in public life is a real matter for concern. The impunity with which we have witnessed officials behave is actually staggering. This aggressive disregard for transparency starts at the very top. It's no wonder the Scottish public sector is so awash with bullying claims when impunity seems to be the norm. Psychiatrists all over the UK were calling for the recent spending review to reverse the cuts since 2010 and enable local authorities to work towards investing £374 million into services so they can cope with the increased need for treatment. These calls this week were ignored. We know now with COVID that we have more than double the amount of people needing our help and that our services had prior to lockdown. And we've got no extra financial support to those services that were already severely limited and restricted in what they could offer in the first place. The stigma of addiction leads to discrimination, exclusion from healthcare and the tragic loss of life. It's evidently wrong that people with the most complex needs and the fewest resources should have to fight the hardest to overcome the greatest barriers and contribute the most financially to access healthcare. Erstwhile, typically enacted by a political class which generally has little experience of the issues for which they legislate. Although addiction and mental health issues can affect everyone, rich and poor, they're far more prevalent in our poorest communities. Finally, a friend who worked for Glasgow City Council addiction team for over 20 years described the last 9 months to me as, I quote, "Normally we can help even a little. It's often just a stick and plaster and a cup of hot tea, some human contact with someone who cares, you know. But with this COVID bullshit, we can't even offer a friendly smile, a hug, or in most cases a kind word, because folks are either totally isolated or many of the people I've worked with are now dead. I've never seen carnage like it. The homeless street sleeping population has easily doubled, and I'd estimate that deaths from addiction have doubled too. But of course, the official figures won't say that. They couldn't possibly tell the truth, could they? And I worry that even if they did, who would really care? Sure, it's only the mental, the junkies and the alkies that are dying." I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Annemarie. That was really good. That was good. Okay, right. So lastly, over to Rob Lyons, who's going going to give us an all-encompassing economic good news story.
I run the Academy of Ideas Economy Forum, amongst other things. And back in January, we had a discussion which I spoke at called "The Coming Crash?" ? I mentioned that because this idea of another big crash like 2008 has been talked about for 2 or 3 years, and it was clear that the world economy is not in the best of shape. The IMF was predicting global growth to be 2.9%, which is the lowest since the 2008 crash. The UK economy would grow by just 1.1%, and the Scottish Government's own assessment in February was estimating something very similar for Scotland. As it happens, at that discussion, we were looking around what might cause this to turn into a crash, and we were talking about another credit crunch or some problems with stocks or whatever. And somebody said, "You hear about this virus in China?" And we all looked at him. It's like, well, anything could happen, eh? So it's like completely, so ironic that we're in this position now where the whole world and the whole news has been dominated by that virus in China ever since. So this isn't what's happened. Has not happened to an otherwise healthy economy. It's one that's been sluggish for over a decade. And then there's the response to the virus. So there's no doubt that shutting down great chunks of economic activity is proving to be very damaging. In his autumn statement, the Chancellor, Rishi Sunak, announced that the UK economy is likely to have shrunk by 11.3% this year overall. And that's the worst one-year fall in economic output for 300 years in relative terms. And once the lockdown measures are finally lifted, we can expect to see some kind of rapid bounce back. When we saw something like that in the summer, we didn't get back to the levels of economic activity we had had before the crisis, but there was quite a significant rebound. But the longer we delay that, the bigger the problems grow, and many businesses will have gone for good, and they won't be quickly replaced if they're replaced at all. UK unemployment is expected to hit 7.5% by next spring, with 2.6 million people out of work, but it will surely go higher than that as the fallout continues. The economy is expected to be 3% smaller in 2025 than it would have been had the crisis not happened. And it's been mentioned a little bit already, but the big impacts have obviously been in those areas that have been most restricted. So we all talk about hospitality because we're all desperate to go to pubs and restaurants and socialize more freely, but it's not just the venues themselves that are in trouble, but all their suppliers as well. Retail was hit very badly earlier this year because it was forced to close down, apart from shops selling essential items. And we've seen that across the whole of England again, and in parts of Scotland again since. And those restrictions on shops lasted longer in Scotland than they did in other parts of the UK. And then there's all the other things that were shut down as well at various points, whether it was cinemas, theatres, gyms, and anything else basically where people gather. Travel has been hugely affected. Airlines have posted massive losses and shed a lot of staff. Some smaller airlines in Europe were amongst the first casualties of lockdown. British Airways announced 12,000 jobs would be cut early on in the crisis, and there's hotels and other forms of travel accommodation for visitors were shut down for months. And even if British people have stayed at home and have holidayed at home to a greater extent than they would normally, there's also been a huge loss of earnings from overseas visitors. So just as an example, the estimate is that the cancellation of the Edinburgh Festival cost the city £1 billion in trade. And a particular problem for Scotland was that construction took so long to get going. The Scottish Government was much more precautionary about getting construction going again than the governments in the rest of the UK. And we have a particular problem for some businesses at the moment that they might make a lot of money at Christmas, like pubs, but anything that's like Christmas related retail now, the kind of people that sell the kind of things you buy for presents and so on. And just to put the tin lid on it, we've got Brexit coming up, which whatever you think about that in the long term is likely to be quite disruptive in the short term as we figure out whatever new rules are going to apply. So what the future holds is hard to say, because we just don't know how long these restrictions are going to last for. The vaccine is great news, and seeing that it's going to start rolling out next week is brilliant. But the effect of that is actually going to be quite a few months away in terms of the epidemic more generally, because we're probably quite rightly focusing on the people who are most vulnerable, the older people and healthcare staff. That means that the sort of broader spread of the virus isn't going to change very much. Older people don't spread the virus very much because they tend to be housebound or in care homes. So that's going to just carry on spreading, and therefore we're very likely to have these restrictions in place for a very long time to come. There's rays of hope. I mean, the AstraZeneca vaccine, if it gets approval, will probably be something that we could roll out more generally compared to the Pfizer vaccine. That might have a bit more of an impact. So it is a story of doom and gloom. There is no doubt a lot of people are going to lose their jobs, and a lot of people are going to be a lot worse off than before the crisis. But there are, to try and pick up some silver linings, the crisis has accelerated a few things that might have taken longer to come through. Working from home seems like a permanent change, even if it's something many people will head back to the office for at least part of the week where they can. Everyone's pig sick of Zoom meetings, but nonetheless, they enable people dotted all over Scotland and beyond to discuss things, whether it's the future of society or the minutiae of work. I doubt this meeting, if it were to be live in Glasgow or Edinburgh, would have attracted quite so many people. And it would be much harder to get this panel together for it. So that's good news. They could have positive benefits in terms of productivity at work. And as a result, I think how we think about transport is going to change as well. Mass transit systems that rely on a lot of people using them on a daily basis may struggle to be economically viable in the future. Whether it's bus services in the big Scottish cities, look at London Transport, for example, it's losing money hand over fist because so many people are not using it. And the lockdown has accelerated the demise of many businesses. And in the short term, obviously, that's bad because we're going to lose jobs and there won't be necessarily jobs to replace them. But the problem with zombie companies, companies are just staggering on through just paying their debt, paying the interest on their debts, but not actually thriving in any way. A lot of those companies are disappearing. I mean, this week we've seen Arcadia go into administration and Debenhams essentially now bust. These are shops that are around on our high street that have become less and less relevant, but we're hanging around. And like these other zombie companies, they take enough trade away from other companies who are more productive, who are better fits for the modern economy, to reduce their profits and therefore reduce the incentive to invest. So that is a real problem. So it'll be interesting to see what will happen in terms of whether that in the longer term or in the medium term has a beneficial effect on the fact that there'll be more money flowing to healthier companies, and a lot of these zombie companies will finally have been driven out of business. So in short, yes, a depression economy will make us poorer. Lower interest rates will also hurt savers and pensioners too. So incomes may be down for reasons other than, excuse me, other than job losses. And finally, something that's been on my mind is that in terms of public spending and that the incompetence of the Westminster government may have made independence more likely. I don't know, we're sure we don't want to get into a massive discussion about independence. That's one for another night. But the fact that Scottish politicians in Westminster had to kind of keep demanding that the UK government would say, well, if we need to go into into lockdown and you're not in lockdown, will we be able to provide a furlough scheme? Will there be business support or whatever? And the Westminster government being very equivocal about it until England had to go into lockdown. And that just, to me, just throws up the problems of Scotland not having control over its own finances as well. And I'm sure that great play might be made of that by independence campaigners in the next year or so. That's me, back to the studio.
Okay, and thanks, Rob. That was interesting. So we seem to have so far broken the problems down into an exacerbation of existing trends and new problems. And I know from looking around the names of the people here that there's people from a really wide range of different areas of social life, of the economy, of different kinds of people with different kind of backgrounds. So really interested to get those perspectives as well. So I've got 4 or 5 people indicating. If your name is just kind of iPhone 782, if you could maybe just change it to whatever your actual name is, then I won't have to call you iPhone 782. And also stick your cameras on so we can see you as well. Even if you're not, even if you're more ugly than Ewan, I suppose. I was thinking of who can I pick on? I'll pick on Ewan. Right. So first of all, I've got Diane sitting here, and then after Diane, there's somebody called Julie. So Diane, kick us off. You'll need to unmute yourself.
Yeah, I've done that. Hi. So it's really in response to Annemarie's presentation, which is just so powerful. It just kind of just gives me goosebumps listening to it. It's just incredible, the numbers, and wow. Okay, so what I'm going to present is probably on sort of an alternative perspective that Stuart was mentioning. So this is around the conversation that a lot of people are having it both in England and in the US. And it's around a new treatment around psychedelic therapy drugs. So it's ancient plant medicines such as psilocybin, MDMA. So recent research from the Imperial College and King's College in London and Johns Hopkins in the US, they're all demonstrating that these psychedelic drugs, along with, you know, as I said, psilocybin and MDMA, they're having amazing results for depression, addiction. Just the numbers are astounding. And in 2018, the FDA in the States granted psilocybin and MDA the status of a breakthrough therapy. So the state of Oregon, last month in November, they've legalized psilocybin for use in therapeutic setting. So that paves the way for other states to follow. And this is going to usher in capital investment in psychedelic therapy and pharmacology to an estimated amount of $2 billion over the next year. So so in the States, it's all, you know, all full speed ahead, and in England, but in Scotland, we're not at the table. We're not having the conversation. There was a oh, by the way, those therapies, they're non-toxic and non-addictive. So the people who are being treated, they have 1 or 2 therapy treatments in a therapeutic setting, and that lasts them for like 4 to 6 months. Sometimes it's permanent, and they have like immediate lifting of depression, addictions go away. It's just incredible. So so yeah, but in Scotland, we're not at the table. We're not part of that conversation. None of the universities here or the hospitals are having that conversation that I know of, and that's why I'm putting out this evening, just maybe somebody else knows something different. So yeah, I think, you know, they're saying this is the future of mental health therapy, and I just interested if anyone's got any opinions or comments.
Okay, all right, thank you. Right, Julie next, and after that, Alex.
So I'm not from Scotland. I'm a Welsh girl living in England for many years, and I'm just really pleased to join this, just to be able to share some views with people who are quite happy to debate these issues, because I think some of my own observations from what's been going on during lockdown and this whole pandemic that's really concerned me is the change in our behaviour, just as a species, as a race, as human beings, and almost a sort of a dehumanization, I suppose. And the sort of things I feel when we're going out and about, we've all become very fearful, anxious, people are becoming increasingly hostile towards each other's, getting reclusive, submissive, distrustful, secretive. And I see all these behaviours and also a lot of sort of anger brewing, and think, well, where have I seen this before? And I'm a retired psychiatrist, and I'm just sort of, as I've been listening to everyone and thinking about this, so the whole concept of learned helplessness and that idea of just giving over and becoming completely hopeless and giving up on that fight and that challenge. And one of the things that's in my former career, I was responsible quite often for, detaining people under the Mental Health Act and use of the Mental Capacity Act, and that sort of fundamental concept of the importance of freedom and that, you know, only being able to deprive people of their liberty and their freedom if it's in a process of law and it's been subject to review, and really having to justify it. And I've just been shocked by how we as a society have allowed all of our freedoms to be taken away. I mean, this whole concept of people not being able to visit family in care homes, and I can't get my head around how up until very recently nobody's challenged that. You know, in pre-COVID world, you wouldn't be allowed. You know, I used to go into lots of residential homes. You couldn't just lock someone up effectively and deprive them of their liberties. And I just think it's a really interesting concept about how we've just kind of all accepted what's going on. And yes, you know, I'm a doctor. Yes, COVID is nasty. I've got lots of doctor friends who work in hospitals in medicine. It's nasty. Lots of my friends have had it. You know, and I was interested in Carl's talk, but I really don't think there's been that balance about what we've done. And again, you know, as a psychiatrist, when I was looking after people with, you know, quite severe depression or other forms of mental illness in hospital, and you're trying to discharge people, one of the most important things that you were looking for in discharge wasn't the tablets, wasn't the this, the that, the other. It was some sort of meaningful occupation. Didn't need to be paid, just something meaningful to do, and, you know, a social connection with other people. And it just feels like some of those most fundamental issues about what it is to be human and to have good health and well-being's been taken away. And then just one sort of slightly less, you know, profound comment, just feeding up from what Carol was saying. I'm a doctor. I used to be a senior lecturer at the local medical school as well, very involved in medical student training. My son started medical school as a graduate September 2019, and I've just been horrified by the complete halt in training of doctors, and the fact that here at a time when we haven't got enough doctors, even before this, and we keep getting told day in, day out how short we are of staff, and yet we've, you know, this, you can't allow people on the wards because of COVID. It's dangerous. Well, in World War II, it was dangerous being a pilot, but did we stop training pilots, or did we train more pilots? I don't know. I just think the world's gone mad. I think we're all suffering some sort of shared delusion that we're just all going along with. But I don't know. It's mad. That's me.
Okay, thanks very much. Alec, and then one of our previous contributors, Carlton, who spoke at a different salon. Alec.
First, a couple of wee things. Simon, what a brilliant panel. Absolutely sensational. Annemarie, what accent? I never heard an accent. I think the thing that I'm kind of struggling a bit with is both Ewan, Carol, and Annemarie in particular put some, as somebody who digs deep into this subject, if you like, I'm still absolutely shocked when I hear the things that you were saying, the facts, the numbers. It's just incredible. But yet, it feels to me, it has either it's getting little airing, or it's simply not having an impact. And that kind of drives me to Stuart's contribution, which was, as you would expect, more sociological, looking at the broader themes of what's happening at the minute. And it's in that area that I'm having a bit of a problem, I think. The facts don't seem to matter. The unintended consequences, which are dramatic, don't seem to matter. But at the same time, the question of liberty seems too abstract. And so that's where I'm sitting at the minute. My instinct is that without the extension and reconstitution of our liberties, the groups that were mentioned for cancer to drugs, etc., are unlikely to have a look in, unless by pure luck. So I wonder if that's somewhere the discussion might go.
Magic, thank you, Alex. Right, so Carlton, then Francis after Carlton.
Hi,
again, just to echo Alex's point, a real depth and breadth of topics and issues to talk about. I wanted to again touch on something that Annemarie raised, because I completely agree with her point that the whole debate around drug consumption rooms is a misnomer here. But I disagree with her point about poverty killing drug addicts. In Scotland, the biggest killer of drug addicts is the state, because they, basically the biggest killer of drug addicts in Scotland are the substitute drugs that the state gives to drug addicts that are killing more people than the drugs that they're addicted to. And so that leads me on to the kind of COVID. The biggest killer in Scotland in the virus, in the pandemic, is not COVID, it's the Scottish state. Because well over 50% of deaths have occurred in the care homes. And why is that? Because the Scottish state knowingly shipped patients with COVID back into the care home system. So my problem, similar to Alex, is that we seem to be having a discussion around COVID, which isn't really a discussion around COVID. And I kind of return back to something Ewan mentioned, which is really, really important, I think, is that it's about trust and trusting people's agency to deal with their particular problems, whether it's addiction or whatever. Because one of the issues with drug addiction in Scotland, the official government policy is to deny drug addicts their agency. It tells them that actually it's society's fault. It's not yours. So what we're doing is we're removing people's ability to act as agents. And I think this is kind of the key to understanding the question around the pandemic and the lockdown, because whilst I agree with many of Stuart's points in the framework, I don't think it's the case that the government doesn't trust us. It's that we don't trust ourselves. There's the disjuncture between Alex's point about here's the information, but nobody seems to be doing anything about it, because we don't trust ourselves to do anything about it. And one of the interesting points about the COVID, and one of the, I think, really good parts of the kind of unintended consequence has been the emergence of groups like Us For Them Scotland, who have emerged as one of the few institutions or organizations of ordinary people who are actually holding the government to account. They're actually holding the Scottish government to account on their policy on closing schools. And I think they're an example of what is possible in the current moment. So whilst the government don't trust us, or whilst elites don't trust us, we need to trust ourselves. And through trusting ourselves and our common and our communities and bonding with other people, we can find a way out of this mess.
Thanks, Carlton. That's really interesting. So that the idea that liberty is too abstract for people to understand is challenged by some of the panel in terms of them putting de-abstractifying, if that's not the right word, whatever the word is, concretizing with facts and figures what is actually happening. But that doesn't seem to upset people in a way that it kind of maybe upsets me and other people here. So people should think about that. I think also if people can also think about what maybe we can do about this. I'm still interested in people's specific stories about how this has impacted on your life in your particular arena. But what can we do about that? That's probably the answer to the question. So we've got Francis and then Jennifer after Francis. Francis.
Hi everyone. I'm one of those people that wouldn't be here if we were in Scotland, because I'm currently living in Wolverhampton. But I'm an ex-senior civil servant, and until 3 months ago, Rishi Sunak was my boss. So I was involved in designing the furlough scheme. That was my job. So I wanted to make a couple of points. It's great to have such an interesting panel, lots of people. And since I've stopped doing that particular job, I've had an opportunity to listen to all sorts of sort of LSE lectures and things like that. So I feel so fortunate to have had a chance to see this thing from a slightly different perspective. However, what I did want to say was that one thing that really bothered me when I was doing that job was that it struck me that the people who were making the decisions suffered from this sort of situational blindness, really, where they sort of had a very one-dimensional approach to looking at how to solve problems. A lot of it was about firefighting, and a lot of it was about making sure that you looked right. So I think the point that Stuart was making about the public being an issue to be managed really sort of struck me as something that I recognise very much on that, trying to manage the public perception and doing things because they look good, as opposed to things that are actually the right thing to do in the situation that we find ourselves in. I was also struck by the things Julie was saying about her surprise about why people are not objecting more to the sort of liberties that are being taken away from us. We were talking about, you know, the unintended consequences of that message to protect the NHS that was given early on and is being given again now. But I've got another question, which is something about the unintended consequences of testing people who are perfectly healthy, sometimes repeatedly mass testing people who are perfectly healthy. And I think that's really shocked me. I haven't heard anybody object to that. But because alongside that sort of idea of the precautionary principle and the sort of comments Julie was making about how people's behaviour has changed since the pandemic, what is that going to lead to? I mean, you can imagine people who are so fearful that what about all the other things they might have, that they're perfectly healthy, but they might have any number of things. Will we not leave home unless we have pre-tested ourselves every morning for every conceivable thing under the sun? And that really worries me about the ethics of testing healthy people. And I wondered if anybody had heard anything about debates that have been going on around that issue. And that's me done. So thank you very much.
Great, thanks, Frances. Okay, so Jennifer, and after Jennifer, Hilary.
Yes, thank you to the panel. And unfortunately and inevitably, it struck a rather pessimistic note on all fronts. But I'm glad that people are sort of trying to work out a little bit which direction to go in now, and that's very, very difficult indeed. I think there's two things to say. You can't talk about unintended consequences anymore, right? That means that people are unaware of the consequences, cannot predict the consequences. But as many people on the panel have already made very clear, it's entirely predictable, the consequences, the economic consequences, the health consequences, the lack of screening and treatment on the NHS and so forth. That's all very, very clear. All of that's being ignored. And we know, and probably this is the most frustrating thing of all, that it's very evident where all this is going, but it doesn't seem to be able to stop the ship in any way. There doesn't seem to be any way of reining back on their strategies. And it comes down to the fact that the governments, both Scottish and the English governments, are still listening to a very one-sided view from experts and ignoring the voice of business, the voice of concerned people in the NHS. And I suppose it's very, very difficult under those circumstances to work out how to actually get these voices known, how to make clear that the very, very much consequential consequences can be pushed through the agenda. And I think really it comes down to the fact that we've all been depoliticized, really. A lot of areas have been depoliticized. And to some extent, I think it's going to require an argument for organization. And Carlton mentioned that Us for Them, this was a spontaneously organized group. But I think, in fact, what we've got to sort of perhaps try and argue for is for groups of specialists to actually organize to, if you like, almost demonstrate against government policy. So to argue for people in the NHS to start saying, how can we practically challenge, NHS leaders and argue for all these underutilized aspects of the NHS to be utilized? But that requires that people actually do organize as professionals, not just to say these things, but in some ways to do something about it. It's very, very easy to sort of say that. I'm like Julia, a retired doctor, and I was even more out on a limb being a community pediatrician. But I still think that we and others can put the argument that people really need to organize practical challenges rather than just simply, vocalizing these sort of problems. And I feel that that at least would offer a kernel around which people can, if you like, gather. So just for example, in something like drug rehabilitation, just organizing people, whether it's in the form of a delegation, a committee, to actually put a number of demands immediately on the Scottish government, just practical things that could be done in the interim before we have the magic cure. I hope that's not too abstract. Thanks.
Thanks, Jenny. So after Jenny, we're going to have Hilary, but after Hilary, I'd just like to go back to the panel, just not for kind of another 5-minute speech each, but if you've got a minute of something you want to say, something you want to stick in there, or your initial thoughts on what's been said so far, do that. And then after that, we'll come out and we'll go to Linda. So Hilary, panel, Linda. Okay, Hilary.
Thanks. So I want to talk about the economy, but I think some of the things I say do kind of read across to some of the other areas that people have talked about. And it almost seems to me that in healthcare, some of these real issues are being recognised when they're just not even being recognised everywhere else. So when, people talk about, people don't have an agency to do anything, they don't even recognise how bad things are. So I know people have said already that people are being very pessimistic, but I thought Rob was actually a bit over optimistic on the economy. And one of the things that's kind of astounded me is that last week in the budget, one of the things that was announced and kind of forgotten about was effectively the UK government defaulting on its debt. And it did that very technically, really, by changing the way in which it defines the inflation measure that sets the return on some of its gilts. Now, the holders of those index-linked gilts, people like foreign governments, bankers, insurance companies, didn't react at all. There was absolutely no reaction to that, almost like it hadn't happened. And that to me is just astounding. Normally, markets would be savage in their destruction of the value of government bonds where a government had done that. And in part of the issue here is with QE. Markets are all so rigged that they don't change in the ways that you might expect them to. But I still find that absolutely astounding. And another area is what is in the mass shift of people to working from home, and professionals in particular just do not seem to recognise that if you never need to be in an office in the UK, why would you long-term employ UK workers who are a lot more expensive and often not as good as workers from elsewhere in the world. So it seems to me that everybody's almost got their fingers in their ears, just pretending all this stuff isn't happening. So I just worry that people are talking from the point of view of what can we do about it, because everybody knows this is wrong. But I think almost outside healthcare, there is no recognition of how bad things are. Sorry to be pessimistic as well.
And on that cheery note, thanks, Hilary. So we'll go back to the panel for a minute each. Annemarie, you were twitching there, so we'll let you go first, okay?
Hi there. It was just on this notion that somehow we could organise and mobilise and get the government to listen. Jennifer was kind of alluding to that there, and we did that last year. We had a series of events and almost 3,000 people took part. We had a conference, we had several rallies in George Square. We created a report with 23 recommendations. And we presented it in front of the Guardian and the Times and the press. You know, we had the backup and support of the media. And these 23 recommendations were completely and utterly stonewalled, completely ignored. So, you know, there's something about the current administration in Scotland, and I am a lifelong member of the SNP, that I found incredibly difficult to accept that they were just they were so powerful that they can now just completely ignore massive organisation and mobilisation and public outrage, and they continue to do that. So.
Okay, thanks. Rob, do you want to kind of come back on Hilary at all?
Well, I mean, I did try. I was trying to find some silver linings.
Hilary.
But yes, no, it is a complete shit show, the economy, let's face it. And the points I wanted to make actually weren't about the economy, really. Though one is that if anybody's followed the discussions like I have over the years about smoking, drinking, sugar in food, things like that, all that which dominates public health, you'll recognise a couple of things. First of all, public health failed in the early period of this crisis because they just weren't ready. Spent so much time obsessing about all that stuff, all about our lifestyles, that they hadn't bothered to organise a proper testing capability or PPE or any of that stuff that you might need in an actual public health emergency. And secondly, that they're upset, they do not trust people to make decisions for themselves and believe that it's the job of public health to step in and micromanage our lives. So it's no surprise that with a crisis like this, that they've just gone completely full board. We just need to lock down, control everything, and hope it will go away. That's their entire attitude. I was also interested in what Frances was saying about decision making. How do we decide what to do about this crisis? Because I think at the moment, alongside all the things that she said, which I think were very, very true, we've kind of got a really shit version of utilitarianism going on, where there's only one measure that we can, well, there's a handful of measures that we can possibly compute at any one time, which is case numbers and hospitalizations and deaths related to COVID, and all else stops. Yeah, that's the only measure is, if we do this, how many deaths will there be, and if we do that, how many deaths will be, but purely about COVID. So they haven't even got the bandwidth to take a broader view of all that. Never mind alternative ways of making those decisions, which might be about rights and about freedom and about the importance of those things as well, because we can't actually really make those calculations. It's a ridiculous idea that we could, but as we could say, well, there's some things that we do think that are sort of immutable, that shouldn't be changed. And amongst those things are these basic personal freedoms that that are absolutely core to our society and will have to serve us decades into the future, long after this pandemic has gone.
Thanks, Rob. Carol, scientific literacy and getting patients organised.
I think, it was great to hear from the psychiatrist, Julie, and also from Jennifer, pediatric community pediatrician, about their perspective on it. I think as doctors, we have been subsumed. The idea that we really have control on the policies and the NHS has long gone. Those days have evaporated. And I think what irritates me so much are the essential irritant lies. Gove on Saturday said we're doing this to protect the NHS again. When you say that to people, 70-year-old people with cancer-like symptoms or heart attack-like symptoms say, I'm not going back to hospital, I'm going to protect the NHS. And he's just telling lies. The numbers are coming down, it's clear. And the numbers are coming down in hospitalization, not because of the lockdown. They were coming down before the lockdown. It was just, we're coming up to a peak and then it comes down. You can see just looking at the government's own data they put out every day. Now it's getting very timely. It goes out at 4 o'clock and you can see a beautiful bell-shaped curve. It's a textbook epidemiology. So basically, I think the mind is perhaps the most important in the body, and keeping everybody together away from the perils of depression and doom and gloom, addiction and everything that leads with it is so important. And I think the lockdown is the antithesis of that. It begets all sorts of mental health problems. And Christmas is coming. You know, government they have no control on what happens at Christmas. I don't know what the rules are, and I'm not going to look at the rules. I'll do what I think sensible, and I won't tell you what I'm going to do. I'm not going to have a massive party. I'm not going to invite 100 people to my house. The last thing I want 100 of my in-laws, but you know, we'll have a few people, and that'll be it. I'll probably get the handcuffs will come round in half an hour. Thank you very much.
Right, so we're all going to Carol's house on Christmas Day. Right, Ewan, on you go. How are things shaping up in your view now?
Having been so well behaved with the time at the beginning, I hope you'll permit me an extra minute just to respond to some of the excellent points that have been made. And thank you so much to all the people that have contributed. There's been some really excellent feedback, and I hope to just touch on a couple of those points. One of the things that Carol said, obviously, after my opening introduction, he talked about the odd nature of some of the restrictions implemented. I think the Scottish Government and probably the Welsh Government take the biscuit on the most bizarre. For instance, in Scotland, the Scottish Government recently announced that international travel will not be illegal, but travelling to the airport will be. That was the first thing that really struck me. Annemarie, obviously, she and I are good friends, and she referred to the drug death capital of Europe, which of course is my city of Dundee. And I think Carlton's absolutely right to talk about the lamentable job that is done by services. I mean, I think that the tragedy is in my city, one of the main Boots chemists, £4 million passes through its till every year, which is comes straight from the NHS for the dispensation of methadone. And I think the interesting thing is that the success rate for people getting free from methadone addiction and prescription is lamentably low. Why? Because those people, their livelihoods depend upon people actually being in addiction. So it's a self-perpetuating cycle. Also, those who suffer from what Rob described as a sluggish economy, it always seems to be those who are on the lowest or most restricted incomes. I think we're in a really tricky position where we're almost handing a stick of economic dynamite to the next generation. I mean, I think, you know, the last slice of the debt on the Second World War, it was only paid off by Tony Blair in 2006. My son, my 8-year-old son, will be a pensioner before we actually get this current debt paid off, and even then it might be beyond his lifetime. Julie talked about the casualty of social connection, and I think she's absolutely right. That has been one of the biggest, the biggest and most tragic casualties, and I think that's really waging war on many people and their predominantly their mental health. My wife and I had a terminally ill cancer sufferer at our door the other week there. Did we stop her coming in? Did we make sure she's socially distanced and stood In the garden, absolutely not. We had her in the house, which was an egregious breaking and contravention of the lockdown restrictions. But we need to restore humanity. I think humanity plays a higher role. Just two more points. I absolutely loved Alex's point, and I think he's right. The stories of people who are experiencing greatest hardship are not getting an airing, not because they're voiceless, just because they're preferably ignored. And I think that's the greatest concern I have at the moment about the media role, and that's been raised in the chat. And also, I wanted to just touch very briefly on what Jennifer said about specialists speaking out. I think the challenge, obviously, is many people's livelihoods depend on maintaining the orthodox narrative and not breaking away from that. But some have been very interesting. One would be Dr. David Nabarro, who was speaking on behalf of the World Health Organization in an interview with Andrew Neil recently, where he said, we really do have to learn how to coexist with this virus in a way that doesn't require constant closing down of economies, but at the same time in a way that is not associated with high levels of suffering and death. And he added just this, and I'll say this just in closing, Simon. He added, we should stop using lockdowns as the primary control method. Lockdowns have one consequence that you must never belittle, and that is making poor people an awful lot poorer. Amen to that, Dr. David Nabarro. You're bang on. Back to you, Simon.
Thanks, Ewan. So, Stuart, the opportunity for more social solidarity. Give us hope.
Yeah. Well, I have few answers. I genuinely, I mean, Jenny's point there I thought was interesting because it's possibly the first, it wasn't abstract at all. It was actually an approach of doing something, because in my head, I kind of, well, what do you do? So I raised this, I'll give you, it's like an anecdote first. And then, so I was at this really strange meeting about, I don't know, about 10 years ago. It was a Chatham House Rules, and it was with all these security people, right? So it was like head of MI5, army chaps, right? All this, there was about 25, 30 of these guys that run security in Britain. And I was invited because I knew somebody there. So I was amongst these people, and it was kind of, it was weird.
You're a security threat.
Yeah, I was waiting for James Bond to come in and, like, you know, do a rollover or something, right? So it was kind of very weird. But there was this general, right, or somebody like that, and he gave this talk about floods and what you should do in floods and how he was preparing, you know, for what we would do in future floods and all the rest of it. And his entire representation of the people was that they were a problem, right? They were a problem. People were a problem. It was like they were sheep, you know, sheep, and being, you know, this, you could see this like water flowing over these sheep-like people, and you know, that's all they can do is flounder in the water. And I raised the question. This as well. Has it ever occurred to you that you might actually want to encourage people to get involved to help out, right? That, you know, what happened to the blitz spirit, blah, blah, etc., and all that kind of stuff. Now, the problem I have is I then think, well, how does that work with a virus, right? Because socially distancing seems to have a reality, or does it? Do we say, you know, really anyone my age, younger, let's just say, because I want to be free, we can be free and just keep the vulnerable safe? How would local people input into terms of, you know, because it's entirely possible that if this was organized voluntarily through the public, and, you know, people were getting much more involved in trying to get a balance on this, that people might say, actually, this is a huge problem and we need to really, we might lock ourselves down, right? But that seems all right to me, to lock ourselves down. I don't have a problem with that. It's that it's being enforced, that it's not involving the public. But I find it very difficult to conceptualize how we can, how we could self-organize and be involved with the science and so on. But I think if we'd had that mindset, we would have had a very different world at the minute. And I think we would have at least have had a government that was being open and honest and having open discussions about what these problems are. Because again, do they not care about cancer patients? Is that true? I mean, they know this. Do they not care about the economy going absolutely down the toilet? They must, you know, they're conscious of this, but you just don't get a feeling of it. You don't get a sense of that. And so I'm just left frustrated that rather than having a society that's become more involved and engaged and so on, it's actually done the opposite to a certain extent, and people have become more isolated from each other. So again, I'm just interested in, you know, what would it mean to have an alternative, publicly engaged approach to this? Because I've got more questions than answers about it.
Okay, thanks, Stuart. And that's where you, the audience, come in, because Stuart's asked a question there and he's posed a problem, and people's perspectives on that will be interesting, and that's where truth comes from. It comes from this kind of collective discussion that we are having now. The answer is an open-ended one in that kind of sense. So right, moving on. So we've got Hilary, and then I think that's Penny after Hilary. Okay, Hilary. No, sorry, not Hilary. Deliberate error. Linda, then Penny.
Hi. I mean, I really do think that it's really much more to do with the fact that the government doesn't actually think that we can be trusted. And, you know, just an answer to Stuart's question, I might have agreed with mask wearing. I might have agreed with a lockdown, but I was never asked. You know, the consent of the public was never sought for any of these things. Our ability to judge and be rational and to make judgments around trust, you know, trust ourselves to do the right thing, we could not be trusted to do that. So it was removed, our agency was removed from us at will. And I think I think this is the most important thing that we've got to remember here, because if we weren't seen as the problem, yeah, we could have been engaged with the government about how to solve this thing, except we were treated as a problem to be managed, locked up, locked down, in and out of captivity. If you take the care home situation, who are the best people to manage a care home? Yeah, not the unions, because they're only interested in the safety of their members. Same with schools. The people who the government would have engaged with if they trusted them to manage the care home were the staff of the care home, the carers, and also the families of the people in the care homes. Same with schools. Parents, teachers, and head teachers are far better placed to work out how we manage the pandemic in these situations. But the government doesn't trust us to do that, so it had to use fear. And I have to remind people, the government weaponized this pandemic by putting a narrative of fear around the data that all the scientists put out there. They catastrophized it, and they put the safety of the NHS at the centre of that fear. So, you know, we're not talking about a benign government here, someone who's just bumbling along and making mistakes. They have set out on the basis that we, the public, are the problem, and when in fact we are actually the solution. Jenny put forward a point there saying, well, we should, you know, maybe we should go to some practical things that we want done. I'm afraid that's already been done, and they're just ignoring it. I mean, the Great Barrington Declaration was exactly that. It was saying, here's what to do in order to go forward, an alternative. But it was way too much about trusting the public to do the right thing. So they just weren't going to listen to that, because they've already set themselves down this course where we the public, you know, the only thing that can be done with us is to be locked down and restricted until they get a vaccine in place. I mean, I think we, the public, have got too used to allowing the government to do things for us. And thinking that our role in all of this happens only once every 4 years when we put across, instead of public proper engagement, proper discursive argument. And so we've allowed ourselves to get lulled into this sense that, you know, the government will always do right by us. So, you know, the sense of shock whenever they began to bring in these restrictions, which were seen as disproportionate, was quite palpable. I mean, Rob Lyons, in one of his paper columns, put forward some practical ideas about how we should be involved, how the public should be involved in these things. And I think, I don't think the government's going to listen to them, not now, but going forward, in order to get a more democratic sense of engagement and the fact that we, the public, are the solution, we have to begin to put forward what we would do in situations like this to manage this, and to do that with each other, so that we begin to trust each other again. So, because I do think the government don't trust us, but I don't think we trust each other either.
Okay, great. That's great, Linda. So who was it? It was Penny. Penny next, and then after Penny, Alistair.
I mean, to me, one of the nicest things about COVID is that we've all exhausted every television opportunity that exists to us, to the point whereby we, for the first time since the 1980s, are all watching the same television programs at the same time. And I think that's quite interesting, because I don't know about everybody else, but I resorted to watching The Crown, and it's really, really interesting drama in the sense that the main theme is this incredible tension that exists between the old customs and ways of doing things in the royal family and the Diana phenomena and the sort of therapeutic kind of approach that she has. And I don't know about everybody else, but I feel like there's an unspoken national conversation going on where everybody's trying to work which side of this horrible debate they belong to, because there's the old royals who are disgusting and heartless and brutal, and then there's the new royals who are sort of self-obsessed and flighty and unresilient and highly problematic too. But it feels, if you like a sort of snapshot of some of the sort of the fact that the people making this program have like played it out as this story. Feels like it's a sort of unconscious recognition of some of the questions that we have about the relationship between duty, responsibility, custom, and democracy. And somehow, even though that's at a very sort of subconscious level, I think people do relate to that. Like, we'd all have liked to have volunteered in relation to the COVID thing, but we weren't ever given an opportunity to volunteer. We all feel very strongly that the situation, particularly where I am in Dundee, I really do feel really, really sad about the situation in relation to the drugs thing. And I can see more and more young people getting into a situation where they just live off drugs, basically, and then they die young. And it's a really disgusting thing to live in a place where that's the state of play, and people and young people have no hope, particularly on sort of working class estates where the economic prospects are so weak. But there's no mechanism through which I can actually exercise any control over that situation. And I'm wondering, Annemarie, whether you think that we need to just deprofessionalize some of this. You've been banging your head against a brick wall for a long time, asking the Scottish Government to give you more money. I think they should give you more money, but maybe the only way that they would turn around and listen would be if we sort of did the Duke of Edinburgh kind of thing, but in relation to drug users. If we just started to organise at a local level to try and address some of the things that we found problematic, because that seems to be the most hopeful way forward through which we could have some sense of responsibility and agency for what's going on at the moment. And I think we should be really careful about some of our critiques. I mean, I actually worry about the criticism that Carol's made about cancer, because in some ways it's not challenging enough. I mean, I understand it from the viewpoint of somebody that's been late diagnosed with cancer, and I have several friends in that position. And I can see that the NHS is really exposed as being really poor at the moment. But I'm wondering to what extent we're really challenging, just by saying, oh, but what about the cancer patients? We're really challenging a culture that's developed and been exposed to us in the last 9 months, where we are encouraged day and night to be obsessed and worried about our health. And I think if I was a doctor at the moment, as much as I, of course, it's your professional area, but once you deprofessionalize it and step outside the professional area, I would actually say that to criticize the well-being agenda, this absolute obsession with the idea that the only thing that you can be as a human being is healthy, rather than living and active and part of your world, would be a good place for health professionals to start to go back to like doctors used to be, where they'd say, oh, for God's sake, stop worrying about your health so much. I think that doing something in almost in an old-fashioned kind of way that's against the contemporary culture, which has been exposed but was already there, is probably one of the best ways forward. I don't know what the answers are, but I feel that wherever we see a problem, it's almost as if we should find our own solution using the energy of people who are asking, you know, what they do with their lives at the moment, because a lot of people are sort of redundant in the actual physical sense of the word.
Okay, thanks, Penny. We are now running short on time, and I'm going to give each of the panel members 2 minutes each towards the end, which will be 10 minutes because there's 5 of them. So we've got 10 minutes to go. So if I've got a few people indicating who want to speak, and I'm going to start prioritizing people who haven't spoken already, but try and keep it short if you can as well, all right? So we've got Alistair and then Beverly after that.
Yeah, so I wanted to come back to some of the points that Carlton and Stuart were raising, because I think it's right. One of the most interesting unintended consequences of this has been not just the extent to which government distrusts the public, but the extent to which the public now distrusts the public as well. And there's a report published yesterday by King's College, which looked at people's attitude to lockdown, both the original one and how that compares to just now. And it was interesting that 72% of people in that survey were disappointed in their fellow public for breaking the rules. Almost half of them were actually disappointed for their friends because they didn't obey the rules enough, or actually, strangely enough, because they did obey them too much. They were kind of disappointed with those people that they know that obeyed the rules as well. So there's this just kind of corrosive distrust amongst the public, which is, I think, very different from, I mean, obviously it's mythologized to a certain extent, but previous emergencies and the way that people have responded to disasters, where communities have found the framework to some extent to knit together, to pull together and respond to that. And that's where I think Stuart's point is on the army and the floods guy is really interesting, because what that is essentially training to be resilient. I mean, that's been the kind of mantra almost of the past decade is teach people resilience. I mean, if you work for a local authority, then you kind of get sent off to these classes to be taught to be resilient. And you know, they seem to start, the starting point is that we're in almost a permanent emergency. I mean, it's always around things like the climate emergency or the terrorism emergency. So there's a starting point that kind of we are going to hell in the handcar. And then there's almost this relentless teaching of being suspicious of the people around you, because they contribute to the problem, either because they're not observant enough of the rules or because some fault within their character. So it seems to me that resilience, this mantra of resilience, actually has the effect of undermining any genuine community resilience. I think Julie had a really good point when she talked about learned helplessness. I mean, that's what these kind of initiatives to me seem to breed. This kind of government intervention actually decommissions any possibility of the public acting together. So how do you respond to that? Well, I mean, it does seem to me that people are right, that there's on one level there's kind of individuals taking the initiative, and I kind of agree with Jenny's thing about specialists could could intervene and try to push us in a different direction. But it seems to me that the main thing that's missing is a kind of political response, a kind of political story about how it is that collectively we can respond to this. I don't think it can just be a kind of take an individual initiative. I think it does seem to me that there's a kind of political response about the way that society reacts to these situations that needs to develop. And it's the, just to finish, it's the kind of one thing that I thought was quite interesting about the way that Sweden has worked over the past 9 months, because people tell lots of different stories about Sweden, and I kind of neither persuaded on the one hand that it's the great kind of liberal society or that it's the society that's going to hell in a handcart because of the way it's responded to COVID. But the one thing they do seem to have done quite usefully is that they have this idea that the public should be trusted, and they've set up their response in a way that they've actually collectively managed to respond to that, and people are trusted on an individual level to take their decisions. And I think if we were to try and develop a political response which takes account of individuals to be trusted, then that would be a good way forward.
Okay, right, quickly on to Beverly and then John after Beverly.
Good. I'll be really quick. I've got a lot to say, but I'll say it really quickly. I want to go back to what Stuart said. Doesn't the government care about the cancer patients? I don't think it's a question of not caring about the cancer patients. I'm sure they do because they've all got families. But I don't think they care about the cancer patients as much as they care about the optics of being the government in power when the BBC cameras are there watching patients being turned away from accident and emergency, and without having enough ventilators and respirators and enough nurses. So my feeling is that a lot of this lockdown is not a health response, it's a politically driven response in order to not be seen, to have allowed the NHS to be overwhelmed. So I think the NHS might well have been overwhelmed if they hadn't taken steps, but I don't think the steps they've taken are necessarily that great. And I'd like to say to Rob, you know, he said we're practicing utilitarianism. I wish to God we were practicing utilitarianism, because if we were, we would be focusing on where we can best spend our resources. And I didn't think I would ever challenge Dr. Sikora, because I'm a great admirer of the work he does, but I've yet to hear. There's a measure which is, he mentioned years of life, not just lives, but years of life. And every single day in offices up and down the country, medical professionals and particularly economists, health economists, are working out the cost of every treatment that we get in terms of cost per year of life or cost of year per healthy life. And I haven't heard that phrase come out once from anyone. And I don't understand why the professionals and the health managers and people all over the country who have the ability to commission these sorts of reports and have the data that can feed into these reports are not producing reports which say, yes, we've saved a 96-year-old woman and we've saved an 88-year-old person. And when you look at what we've done to our economy, trillions in debt, hundreds of thousands going to be unemployed, children's exams up the wall, you know, you can go on and on and on. Not just the cost today, but the cost over the next 10 years, 20 years of paying back those debts, the cost of not having that revenue coming in taxes, the cost of it not being available, not just for the NHS, but for every single public sector service that we have, then actually what it probably amounts to is that we are spending millions and millions of pounds per year of life saved. And if I had a particular cancer, there would be certain treatments that I wouldn't get because they would be deemed too expensive for the number of healthy years. There are thousands of people being denied so many treatments because a calculation has been done that it's not worth the money for the number of healthy years we're buying you. And I have not heard a single voice who has done that calculation or who is making that argument. And it has to come from the medical profession. So Dr. Sikora, I know you say you can't write the policies, but why aren't you standing up and saying, you've denied me £100,000 per year of life to save this child's, to save a child's life in my care, and you've spent 50 million, 100 million on a year of life for an 88-year-old person to come in and get treatment for COVID and have their life preserved.
Well, John, you're down to 30 seconds. Then I'm going to go for Julian Paul and Holly really, really quickly. And then it'll be a minute each for each of the panel members.
Okay,
Sorry,
30
guys.
seconds coming up. The big takeaway I'm coming away from here is really one of the points that Stuart raised, and that is a fundamental failing to hold government to account by mainstream media, and particularly here in Scotland, the parliamentary opposition. Informed opinion, judicious use of data rather than dumb use of data is left very much to fragmented groups and social media. So question, would any member of the panel like to comment and have any thoughts on how this failing could be addressed? Thank you.
Right, sorry, I said Julie next, but Julie, I think you've spoken. Could we just go to Paul and Holly, and then if we've got time, we'll go back to Julie and Jenny. So Paul.
Hello, you can hear me, I guess.
Yep, go for it.
I'm glad I'm speaking to Scottish people, because what I'm going to say is very, very distilled. My point was going to be about liberty and how liberty is characterized as libertarianism, because liberty has been brought up very much on this today. And I was thinking back to democracy. I don't remember democracy ever called democratarianism. It's seen as a self-evident good. Whereas, as I say, libertarianism at best is seen as being a principle. So again, cutting it really short, I guess I see the challenge to people that want to fight for liberty. How do they get from being just seen as being libertarianisms, but presenting liberty as a democracy is as just simply being a self-evident good?
Thanks, Paul. Okay, people can answer that. Holly, 30 seconds.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Go for it.
Hi, yeah. I just wanted to say that kind of a broad issue that I think has been thrown up by the whole COVID situation is that it's really exposed the poverty of the Scottish political imagination. I would say in two ways: the resurgence of the independence issue, which has been easy to leverage in these circumstances with the kind of trade-off between Sturgeon and Boris. But then in terms of social issues as well, and when we wonder why we can't form political responses or make kind of impactful social organizations in the face of these, it's because we're only concerned as a general population with social issues like, no disrespect, the mental health issue or the drugs issue. So for instance, the Tilly that Ewan writes for practically every day, their only stories are on drugs and mental health. And I just think that it's just exposed, like I said, this vacuum at the centre of the Scottish imagination. It's been colonised for so long with social issues and now with the independence issue. And it seems to me that that's all we have left. So when people do organise, for instance, the freedom marches, they're kind of laughed out of town because people can't understand these big political ideas like freedom anymore. I'm being a bit reductive and maybe a bit harsh, but just a general point.
Right, thanks. I'm going to give Jenny and Julie 30 seconds each, and then we're back to the panel. Jenny.
What about relating to the Scottish elections next year and putting out a pamphlet in which we bring together all these people who've tried to put a point of view to the Scottish government and have been stonewalled, putting it in black and white and trying to distribute it as widely as possible on the basis that the Scottish government is failing the people. Never mind COVID, what about all these other issues?
Great, that's a good idea. Julie.
Yeah, just some final thoughts really. I've sat on a number of nice clinical guideline development groups. So Beverly mentioned about what we call qualies. I'm going to leave it to Carol if he wants to talk about that, but I can speak only for myself. I've been shouting about qualies from very early on, and it really, yeah, don't get me started. Just another word, the science. I've been shouting like there is no such thing as the science, and the sort of science that we're getting told about on the telly all the time, as far as I'm concerned, is not the science. I feel that chaos, there's just chaos. I mean, we're all familiar with the phrase running amok. From a psychiatric point of view, one of the weird and wonderful syndromes we learn about as trainees is the condition amok. I think there's an international amok going on. I think that this chaos is also part of it. You know, I signed up in March. I got my license back because I only retired recently. I've signed up to goodness knows how many things to go back and help the NHS. I should have been going to this Nightingale, that Nightingale, all sorts of things. None of it's come to fruition. They don't need us. They don't want us. We're fighting to go back. They don't want us. I've been spending the last 3 weeks trying to find out how I can go and jab people with this vaccine. I still don't know. What happened to the we're not giving in to terror mindset? You know, when if we have terror events, we don't all suddenly stop using the tube or going to London or flying or whatever. And
thanks, Julie. We're going to have to move on. Right. So in the order that they spoke, which was Ewan, you've got like a kind of minute and 15 seconds. Ewan, go.
Thank you, Simon. Can you hear me again? Yeah.
Yep. Go for it.
Yeah, thank you very much for chairing the meeting tonight, Simon. You've done a great job, and I really appreciate that. And thank you everybody for your excellent contributions tonight. I mean, I asked the question at the outset of the night is how can we support people best without becoming over paternalistic in the use of legislation that restricts freedom and liberty, which is a contingent part of what makes us human. And I think I come back to the point I made at the outset of the night that the greatest casualty here has been liberty. Paul asks what's about liberty and libertarianism. I mean, I am anything but a libertarian, given that I've worked in the voluntary sector my entire life, but I'm a massive proponent of liberty. So I don't see the conflict there. I think there are two words that often get intertwined unnecessarily. I think the thing I've been reflecting on is there's a wonderful quote by C.S. Lewis in which he says, of all tyrannies, a tyranny sincerely exercised for the good of its subjects may be the most oppressive. And I think that we need to rediscover our love for liberty, our love for freedom. I think about, when we came out of the Second World War, there was Beveridge, there was Bevan, there was Ben, there was the recreation of of society and the building of the welfare state. I mean, William Beveridge famously said, adventure comes not from the half-starved, but those who are well fed enough to feel ambition. And there was something of the relationship between the state and the citizen. We've moved from a relationship between the state and the citizen to regulation between the state and the citizen. And I think that's profoundly disturbing. I think that I absolutely agree with Penny about deprofessionalising. Rebecca Wallace made a comment in the chat, and she's absolutely right that there are brilliant projects in Dundee that are responding to need, but it's deprofessionalised. It's in communities. It's not through services that are well sustained. Sorry, Simon, I'll just close on this point. And I think Holly is right. It's a lack of political imagination. We need to get back to working from the grassroots, from communities. That's where the real change happens, not in the corridors of power. Back to you, Simon.
Right, Ewan, right. Carol.
Very quickly, the real reason we can't be ageist in the NHS, so we're not allowed to do the life years left, because otherwise you'd always prioritise people that are younger. So you, Simon, would get better service than me simply because I've got less long to go on a life table. It doesn't matter what.
I'm just young looking.
Exactly. So I think we have to be very careful. I think just listening to it, liberty, truth, and politics, they don't mix. And politics, it's a Darwinian evolutionary system, politics. Politicians are there not to do any good, but there to be re-elected. That's their success. That's all it is. And if you think of it that way, it's perhaps not surprising that liberty and truth are irrelevant. They test out by leaking stuff to the media to see how the public will tolerate and then implement it within 48 hours. Very clever people working on psychops in Downing Street. They have a whole unit doing it, and it's very skillfully done, whether we like it or not. I even read they're bringing the army to look at vaccination intelligence about anti-vaxxers, who are a potent threat to the success of this campaign. And I've just looked at the Twitter because I'd be supportive of the Pfizer vaccination, a lot of hate stuff from the anti-vaxxers. And it's like the anti-vivisection. It's the same level of hatred that comes out. I'll stop there, but it's been a very interesting discussion indeed, Simon. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Carol. That's been good. Stuart?
Yeah, I'll just pick up from, I think, what Holly was saying and what Penny was discussing. And I suppose this is what I think of as my role. People in my sort of situation, I've got an element of a public voice, is to try to give the public some armory against what's happening. And I think one of the ways that we need to do that is to unpick and try and smash as much as possibly the sort of therapeutic dimension that is this whole issue is drenched in. And in particular, it comes in the form of the idea of being caring, right? Being a caring politician. I don't know if you've noticed, almost every advert on the television now wants to give you a hug, right? I don't know if you've noticed, Halifax now are phoning people, right? Phoning people just to say, are you all right? When the hell did it become the job of banks and building societies to become your therapist? I mean, seriously, almost every advert now treats us like some sort of soft little puppy that needs to be cuddled and whatever. And that's, honestly, I think I know people are laughing, but it's a serious point in terms of how this issue is represented and engaged with, and the way the politicians talk about saving lives, save the NHS. It's breathless, you know. It's like that. It is Diana-esque in terms of their representation. And the problem with this is that it's a form of moralizing, right? This isn't real politics. This is moralizing around being caring, and which means three things. It means, one, it means that it's not rational, right? This stops being rational in terms of political and social policy decisions, because it's around this kind of mawkish, we care, right? So that's the first point. Second point is it closes down debate, right? Because if you raise questions about it, how dare you, you're killing people, right? So I've had like about 10 people say I should be sacked over this 6 months because I've raised questions about the Scottish government. And the third thing, which is, I think Penny was saying at the end, it turns people inwards, right? It encourages people to become fragile, to think of them, to become preoccupied about themselves, to become weak in many respects, become preoccupied with their health, with their mental health, with their illness and all the rest of it. And instead of getting people turning outwards into the world and having a sense of capacity, it does the absolute opposite. And I think if we can try and smash this bullshit caring culture, which is really just a form of moralizing, then at least it'll give people the sort of the language and the capacity, perhaps, to actually tell government where to stick aspects of their caring, save lives rhetoric.
Very useful. Thank you, Stuart. So Annemarie, on you.
Yeah, thanks everybody for a really interesting discussion. What I've found most interesting, actually, abstractly, is the amount of women that have not only raised their voice, but that are used to being heard and that are used to talking. You know, as I'm making a comment on class here, and you know, women in my community don't have that same confidence. They don't have that same assuredness. They're not used to being heard, and I think that is one of the measures that we could use, if we could, to get, that's what's missing from Scottish Government accountability at the moment, that the ordinary punter, the ordinary, you know, the majority of people here tonight are very well educated and very middle class, and that's great, and our voices, or your voices, should be raised, you know, but I really think the solution lies with the ordinary punter in the community. I really do. I think it's voices like mine that should be raised and that needs to be discussed, because we're ordinary people with ordinary, no-nonsense ideas. We know how to look after ourselves and we know what's wrong. And I think there's a level of expertise and experts that are invested in what Stuart alluded to there, rhetoric, posturing and farce. You know, and that in itself gets fed from other experts and professionals. And actually, if we take it right down to grassroots levels and had some sort of mechanism for people in ordinary communities and their voices to be raised, I think we would be living in a much fairer, more sensible world. Leave it there.
Okay, thank you. Okay, lastly to Rob.
To Beverly, yes, I did say it was a shit form of utilitarianism that was being practiced. So not the greatest happiness with the greatest number, or whatever the shorthand is, but the fewest number of COVID deaths, that's it. And of course, with all the sort of terrible consequences that such a narrow view could have. I couldn't agree more with Julie about the science. I think that there are genuine scientific debates to be had about all of this, and shutting them down, or being, as Stuart said, just being accused of wanting to kill people because you question a few things, I think is a really shocking state of affairs, which we got from the climate change debate. You're not allowed to discuss that, even if in the most mild-mannered terms. You want to destroy the planet and kill future generations or something. Anyway, my main point was, in terms of the elections next year to Holyrood, I think we need to say, never mind Scottish independence, what about our independence? Because it doesn't, whatever the constitutional arrangements that we have, if we have a political class that doesn't listen to people, doesn't have any trust in people, doesn't believe that we can protect ourselves from these problems, then we are screwed, because we're going to be living in one way or another in some form of lockdown, in perpetuity. And I think that that's the starting point, is to reassert our desire to control our own lives.
Excellent. Thank you, everybody. This has been really good, and I've noticed that we've actually held on to the vast majority of people who signed up for this and kind of logged in this evening. So they've stayed and they've listened to not just the panel. My thanks go out to the panel, but my thanks go out to everybody who's contributed and everybody who's listened. What you can do is you can try and follow the group Scotland Salon on Facebook, and by signing up to that, you'll be kept abreast of future discussions that we're going to have. You can also, this evening's been recorded. It will be edited and shared on that Facebook page as well, so you can share that to people who haven't managed to make it to this evening and you think would have been interested in it if they had. Next year, 2021, we're going to have a program. We're going to try and plan a program of events that kind of link and take us into the elections in May. So we'll have a program of linked discussions that we'll probably try and pull together over the next few weeks and publicize then. And we're going to stick around. If people want to stick around and chat, they're absolutely happy to do that. But if you're not going to, have a great Christmas and a happy New Year. And we'll see you in 2021, if you survive the pandemic, that is. Okay, it's been great. So informal chit chat now.